The road into Barlow Hollow didn't show up on most maps. Mara had checked 3 different ones before realizing that it wasn't an accident. The narrow, gravel road twisted between the trees like it was trying to hide, winding through thick forests that grew darker the deeper she drove. Cell service vanished 10 miles back. The last house she passed was a trailer half swallowed by kudzu. Her editor at the Ledger called it a perfect feature piece. An offbeat human interest story about Appalachian isolation, the kind of community that refused outsiders, the kind that still made its own laws. Mara was 28, hungry for a real byline, and too stubborn to say no. The air smelled of wet leaves and metal when she finally reached the sign. It wasn't a real sign, just a rusted plank nailed to a fence post. Barlow Hollow, keep out. She parked her Subaru beside the road. The forest pressed in so tightly that the car doors barely had space to open. From somewhere in the distance came the muffled rush of water, a creak, maybe, and something else underneath it, a hollow rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. Just wind, she told herself, checking her recorder. Mara's contact was a man named Clyde Barlow, the last living member of the original family that had given the hollow its name. He'd been born there, lived there, and according to local records, had never left in 72 years. When she called him a week ago, his voice had been thin and papery but sharp. People don't come here, Miss Caldwell. They wander in, and they don't all wander out. He'd laughed after that, a dry, rattling sound, and told her to meet him by the old church, near sundown. That was the part she didn't like. Sundown in these mountains came early. The road shrank to a footpath about a half-mile in. The trees hung heavy with moss, and the silence was thick enough to taste. Every so often, she'd hear something shift in the underbrush. Probably deer, she told herself. Probably. When the church appeared, it startled her. It was smaller than she expected, one of those clapboard Appalachian buildings that might have been a chapel a century ago. Now, the roof sagged like a tired spine, and a bell lay half buried in the dirt out front. The cross above the door was made of 2 sticks tied with twine. Clyde was sitting on the steps. He was a wiry man, his face lined like folded paper, with a white beard and eyes that were too pale to pin down. Not quite blue, not quite gray. He wore an old coat that looked older than she was. "You took your time," he said. There wasn't much of a road," Mara replied. He chuckled without smiling. "Ain't much of a world past here either." She sat beside him, trying to act at ease, but every part of her felt watched. The woods around the clearing were too quiet. No birds, no wind. Clyde's gaze never left her. "You're here for a story," he said finally. "Well, the hollow's full of stories. Problem is, most don't belong to the people who tell them." "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, lowering his voice, "that this place remembers more than it forgives." He stood and motioned toward the church door. The hinges whined as he pushed it open. Inside, it smelled of mildew and something older, like stone dust. Faded hymnals sat on warped pews, and a dozen candles burned low along the altar. The only light came from a hole in the roof, a pale beam catching the motes in the air. On the altar sat a stack of Polaroids. Mara frowned. "What are those?" "People who came looking," he said. "Like you." He gestured for her to take one. She hesitated, then picked up the top photo. It was a picture of a woman, hair matted, face dirty, eyes wide with confusion. She looked half-starved. The background was unmistakable, this very church. Mara turned it over. On the back, written in careful block letters, "Found 2013. Asked for the trail out." "Who took these?" she asked. Clyde smiled with no teeth. "Same one who'll take yours if you stay after dark." They sat in silence for a while after that. The wind crept through the cracks in the wood, carrying the faint sound of rushing water again. Or maybe it was something else. Mara couldn't shake the feeling that the sound was closer now. "Is there a hotel or somewhere I can stay nearby?" she asked. Clyde laughed. "Ain't nowhere nearby, Miss Caldwell. You either stay here." He tapped the floorboards with his boot. "Or you leave before the forest decides it likes you." The sky outside had already begun to dim. The last strip of sunlight through the trees turned the air orange, then blood red. She checked her watch, 5:42. Sundown wasn't supposed to hit until 6:20. Still, the light was vanishing faster than she'd ever seen. She looked up to ask Clyde something else, but the step beside her was empty. "Mr. Barlow," she called. No answer. Outside, the woods looked thicker than before. The air was colder. The car was a dark shape barely visible through the trees. And from somewhere, she couldn't tell how far, came a faint, rhythmic knocking. It sounded like someone tapping on wood. 3 slow knocks, then silence. 3 more. Then one single, long drag across something hollow, scrape. Mara turned toward the sound, hard hammering. "Clyde." No reply. The forest breathed once, all at once, every leaf shivering in the same breath. And then everything went still. Mara didn't sleep that night. She told herself it was just nerves, exhaustion, and the smell of mold from the old church walls. But that wasn't true. The truth was the knocking. It started again after midnight. 3 slow knocks. Then a pause. Then another 3. Always from a different direction. Sometimes the floorboards. Sometimes the wall behind her. Once from under the pew, where she'd stretched out her sleeping bag. She'd stopped calling for Clyde after the second hour. Something told her she wouldn't get an answer. By morning, the air was thick with fog. She stepped outside to find the forest shrouded in white. The trees just dark silhouettes. Her car sat 20 yards away, glistening with dew. For 1 second she felt relief. Then she saw the prints. They weren't boot prints or bare feet. They were small, narrow depressions in the soil, like fingers had pressed down hard into the mud, dragging toward her car in crooked lines. Dozens of them. She forced herself not to look long. The forest felt awake. She left the church by mid-morning, following the creek she'd heard the night before. It wound deep between 2 ridges, its water black and slow-moving. The deeper she went, the quieter it became, until even her own footsteps sounded wrong, like they belonged to someone else walking behind her. She found a house a mile in, or what was left of one. The roof had collapsed, and vines crawled through the broken windows. Someone had carved symbols into the front door, circles within circles, a cross turned sideways. There was a jar hanging from a string on the porch. Inside it floated a human tooth. Mara almost turned back then, but part of her, the part that had driven 4 hours into the mountains alone, refused. She took a few photos, recording the sound of the wind, her own shaky breathing, then moved inside. The smell hit her first. It was the stench of rot, but dry, old rot, mixed with something faintly metallic. In the living room, she found more Polaroids scattered across the floor. Some were warped by water, others half-burned. Faces stared up through the grime. Different people, men, women, even a child, all taken in front of the same church. Each one had writing on the back. Found 1998. Asked for the trail out. Found 2004. Asked who was calling. Found 2013. Asked where everyone went. And then one she hadn't seen before. Found 2020. Still asking. The photo was newer, the color clearer. The person was Clyde. Her hand shook as she stepped outside. The fog had thinned, but the forest was still empty, unnaturally empty. Even the creek seemed to run quieter now. That was when she saw the second jar. It hung from a branch right at eye level. The water inside was cloudy, the lid rusted. Something pale floated near the bottom. She leaned closer. It wasn't a tooth this time, it was an eye. She staggered back, nearly tripping over a root. Her camera hit the ground. When she bent to pick it up, something caught her eye. On the tree trunk beside her was a mark, fresh, cut deep with a knife. A single word. Listen. Mara's voice recorder picked up the first sound at 1:43 p.m. A low, steady hum. Faint, almost like wind. Then 3 knocks, loud, deliberate, close. She spun around, and there was Clyde. He was standing by the creek, looking thinner, older somehow. His clothes were damp. His skin had a gray tinge. "Miss Caldwell," he said. His voice was calm. "You shouldn't be gone looking." She took a shaky step toward him. "What is this place? Why are there?" "Pictures," he interrupted. "Reminders. The Hollow don't forget faces." "Forget," she whispered. "Forget what?" He smiled faintly. "Who it belongs to." He pointed toward the creek. The water was barely moving, but when she looked closely, she saw faces in the reflection, dozens of them, all pale, wavering beneath the surface, eyes open, mouths moving, like they were speaking to each other, or to her. Mara stumbled back, blinking, but when she looked again, there was only her reflection, and Clyde was gone. By evening, the fog returned, thicker this time, crawling across the ground like smoke. Mara decided to leave. Screw the story, screw the paper. She needed out. But when she reached the car, the passenger side window was cracked open. She was sure she hadn't left it that way. Her backpack sat on the seat, unzipped. Inside, her phone was missing, and so was one of her notebooks. In its place was a single Polaroid. Her, asleep inside the church. Someone had written across the bottom in blue ink, "Asked for the trail out." Mara slammed the door and turned the key. The engine sputtered once, twice, then went dead. She tried again. Nothing but a clicking sound. The air smelled like gasoline and something else, the faint, sweet scent of decay. From the woods came movement. Not footsteps exactly, something dragging. Wet. Slow. Getting closer. She turned on her flashlight and swept it across the trees. For a split second, the beam caught movement, a figure between the trunks. It was Clyde, but his head was tilted, water dripping from his beard. She blinked, and he was gone again. Her heart hammered. She threw open the glove box, grabbing her spare keys and the small knife she kept for camping. Her breath fogged the windshield. Then, 3 knocks on the roof of the car. She froze. Knock, knock, knock. A long pause. Then one slow scrape down the metal, like fingernails dragging across paint. She wanted to scream, but her throat locked. Then silence. She waited. 10 seconds. 20. The fog pressed against the windows like hands. Finally, she whispered, "Please stop." A voice, soft and wet, came from just outside the glass. "You're already in, Miss Caldwell. The Hollow just ain't finished remembering you yet." When she finally ran, leaving her bag, her recorder, everything, she didn't look back until the forest opened up into the road again. There was no sign of the car. No sign of Clyde. No sign that she'd ever been there. Just the signpost, standing crooked in the dirt. The words had changed. Mara woke to the sound of water. It was dark, not night dark, but something thicker, like ink floating in the air. She was lying on damp ground. Her clothes clung to her, heavy with mud. Her last memory was running. The road, the fog, the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. But now there was no road, only the creek, and the sound of water rushing uphill. She sat up slowly. Her hands were trembling. The forest looked wrong. The trees leaned inward, their trunks warped, their roots jutting out like ribs. Everything was too still, like the world had paused mid-breath. The sound came again, a low, steady hiss, as if the water were whispering words just below her hearing. She strained to listen. It wasn't her imagination. There were syllables, soft, drawn out, overlapping. Her name. Mara. Mara, come back. She stumbled to her feet. The fog swirled at her ankles like something alive. She followed the sound, though every instinct screamed not to. The creek widened into a pool, perfectly round, perfectly still. The reflection of the moon quivered on its surface. For a moment she saw herself, pale and shaking. Then another face appeared beside hers. Clyde. He looked clearer now, more real than when she'd seen him last. But his eyes were empty, and his skin glistened with a sheen like wet stone. "You ran," he said softly. "They don't like when you run." "Where am I?" she asked. "What is this place?" He tilted his head. "Same as it's always been. The Hollow's a mouth, girl. Been whispering for centuries. We just forgot how to listen." Her pulse thudded in her ears. Listen to what? Clyde took a slow step closer, water dripping from his clothes. To what's underneath. He reached into the pool and pulled out something slick and pale, a photograph. He handed it to her. It was soaked, the ink bleeding, but she could still make out the image. Herself, standing by this very creek. Behind her, in the fog, a dozen faint silhouettes. "Who are they?" she whispered. "The ones who answered," Clyde said. Mara stumbled backward. The ground squelched under her boots. Every shadow between the trees seemed to breathe. She turned to run, but the path she'd come from had vanished into mist. "Stop fighting it," Clyde called. "The hollow don't take kindly to noise. It remembers the quiet ones best." His voice echoed strangely, as though coming from the water itself. Then his face began to dissolve, the edges melting into ripples. His body followed, sinking without a splash. Mara backed away, her chest heaving. She tripped over a root and fell hard. When she looked up, the pool was gone. Just forest, just fog, just silence. But she wasn't alone. A figure was standing between the trees, tall, narrow, its head slightly tilted. She couldn't make out details through the mist, but its outline shimmered faintly, like light reflecting through moving water. Then another figure appeared beside it, and another, dozens of them, forming a half-circle around her, perfectly still. The whispering began again. Not just one voice, hundreds, layered over each other. The air vibrated with it. Found asking listening. Her ears rang. Her nose started to bleed. She clamped her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't just around her. They were inside her head. "Stop," she screamed. "Please. You came to hear." The ground trembled beneath her. The trees leaned closer, branches creaking. The fog pulsed like a heartbeat. "You came to remember." The figures stepped forward in unison. As they did, the fog peeled back just enough for her to see their faces, each one pale, waterlogged, distorted, eyes open too wide. Some she recognized from the photos, and one of them was her. Her knees buckled. She crawled backward, shaking her head. The duplicate of her stepped closer, the same face, same hair, but wrong somehow. The mouth twitched too much when it smiled. "You can leave," the double said in her own voice. "But you have to leave something behind." "What?" she whispered. "What do you want?" "A story," it said. "You came for one. You'll give it back." Before she could react, the double lunged, but instead of hitting her, it passed through her like cold smoke. The world exploded into sound, screaming water, whispering trees, the static buzz of voices overlapping. She was underwater, choking, thrashing. Hands pulled at her from below, dozens of them, gripping her arms, her ankles, her hair. She saw flashes of faces, mouths open wide, bubbles spilling from their lips, all whispering the same word. "Listen." Her chest burned. She kicked and clawed, breaking the surface. The air was ice. She crawled onto the bank, coughing up black water that reeked of iron. The pool behind her had gone still again. Only her reflection stared back, wide-eyed, trembling alive. But behind her reflection, faint and clear, was Clyde's face, smiling. "You heard it now," he said. "You belong." She ran until dawn. The forest never seemed to end. The hills repeated. The paths looped back. She screamed for help, for anyone, until her voice gave out. When she finally stumbled onto a dirt road, the sun was just rising over the ridge. There, standing in the middle of the road, was a man in a state trooper's jacket. She nearly collapsed with relief. "Jesus," she rasped. "You have to help me. There's something in the woods." He held up a hand. "You came from Barlow Hollow?" Her breath caught. "Yes." He sighed, shaking his head. "We tell folks to stay clear." "That place," he trailed off, looking past her toward the trees. "It don't forget the ones who listen." Before she could answer, he turned and walked toward his cruiser. She followed, desperate, dizzy, until she saw the name patch on his back. Barlow. And dripping wet. She screamed and stumbled backward, but the sound died in her throat. The forest around her began to blur again, the air twisting, bending. The trooper turned. His face was half shadow, half reflection. "You can't unhear it," he said. "The hollow's in your head now." Mara never wrote the article. She tried. God knows she did. But every time her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her ears filled with water. Not real water, not dripping or pouring, but the sound of it, muffled, rhythmic, breathing. 2 weeks had passed since Barlow Hollow. She'd made it out somehow. A trucker found her on Route 26 at dawn, barefoot and covered in mud. She'd told him she got lost hiking. He didn't ask questions. People didn't, around here. Now she lived out of a motel in Johnson City. Room 7. Curtains always closed. TV always on. The steady noise helped drown out the whispers that returned every night. At first, she thought it was trauma, the brain looping through panic, grief, exhaustion. But then things started to go missing. Little things. Her hairbrush, a shoe, her wallet. She'd find them later in strange places, the sink, the shower, under the pillow, damp, as if pulled from a river. And every morning, there was a new Polaroid under her door. They were always wet. They were always of her, sleeping. She told the motel clerk someone was sneaking in. He changed the locks. The next day, another photo. This one of her sitting at her desk, writing, taken from behind her. The timestamp in the corner read 2:46 a.m. But she hadn't been awake at 2:46 a.m. That night, she tried something different. She placed her phone on the nightstand, set to record audio. She left the lamp on, sat upright, and waited. Hours passed. The hum of the air conditioner was steady, almost comforting. Around 1 a.m., she must have dozed off. When she woke, the light was off. The phone was still recording, and there was water on the carpet. She played the recording with trembling hands. At first it was only static, then faint in the background knocking. 3 times. Then silence. Then her own voice whispering, "You can't unhear it." She dropped the phone. The air in the room had changed, thick, wet, like the world was holding its breath. When she looked at the mirror above the sink, it was fogged over. She wiped her sleeve across it and froze. In the reflection, she wasn't alone. Clyde stood behind her, smiling that same empty smile. But this time he spoke. "The hollow remembers you now. It don't need the mountains anymore." He reached forward, and his reflection's hand touched her shoulder. The real one felt it. Cold, wet, real. She turned, but there was no one there. Just the steady drip of water from the ceiling. Only, when she looked up, there was no leak. The drip came from inside the light fixture. By morning, the motel manager found her room empty. The bed made. No sign of struggle. But the sink was full of black water, and on the counter sat a Polaroid. Found 2025. Asked for quiet. 3 weeks later, her editor received a package with no return address. Inside was a flash drive. The label read simply, "Barlow Hollow, Final Draft." The recording began with Mara's voice, tired, weak, but steady. "If you're hearing this, it means I got out, but I think it followed me. It wants to be told. Maybe that's the only way it stays quiet. Maybe if I tell it right, it'll stop whispering. Barlow Hollow isn't a place. It's a memory, a living one. It doesn't haunt you with what it shows you. It haunts you with what it makes you remember. The sound, the voices, they're not from the dead. They're from what the land remembers. And when you listen long enough, it starts remembering you, too." A pause. A faint knock. Then her breathing quickens. "I can hear them again. They're in the walls. They want me to." The recording ends with a splash. Months later, hikers near the Tennessee border discovered an abandoned recorder in the woods. Inside it were several audio files labeled CH1, CH4. Each one began the same way, Mara introducing herself, her voice shaking. But in the final recording, the last 10 seconds were nothing but the sound of running water. Then a woman's voice whispering, "Listen." The hikers didn't stick around. They left the recorder with the park rangers and never went back. But the rangers who cataloged the evidence later reported something strange. Every night, after the office lights went out, they'd hear a slow, steady knocking coming from the storage room. When they checked, the sound always stopped. And the next morning, one more Polaroid had appeared in the evidence file. The most recent one, dated October 2025, showed a man in uniform sitting at a desk, looking at the camera. On his name tag, Barlow. Epilogue. There's a saying in Appalachia that doesn't make sense until you've heard it for yourself. The mountains don't echo. They listen. What Barlow Hollow wanted wasn't a sacrifice, or blood, or even fear. It wanted memory. It wanted witnesses. And it got one. A journalist who came for a story, and gave it one instead. If you ever find yourself driving through the Appalachians, and you hear knocking from the trees, don't answer. Don't listen. Because once the hollow knows your voice, it never forgets the sound.